Hello, and welcome to the latest Structured Finance in Focus podcast. My name is Susanne Albers, and I'm a Group Credit Officer for Fitch's Structured Finance team. Today, I'm joined by Will Rossiter, the Head of ESG and Climate Risk for our Structured Finance department. In this episode, we'll be discussing Fitch's contemplated framework for analyzing physical climate risks for structured finance and covered bonds, which we outlined in a recent discussion paper. Will, to get started, could you please describe some of the underlying principles Fitch is considering for the analysis of physical climate risks in structured finance and covered bonds?
Thank you, Susanne. The effects of physical climate events are therefore all to see, and Fitch believes that these could be material for the performance of the underlying loans backing structured finance transactions and covered bond programs. These should therefore be considered more clearly within our rating methodologies. We expect the rising frequency and intensity of physical climate events to have a larger impact on future asset performance than what has been observed in historical data. This means that, all else being equal, securitized assets with longer time horizons are expected to face greater risks from physical climate events than those with shorter durations. Now, we acknowledge that climate science is by definition not entirely precise. Therefore, one of our principal aims is to make a relative distinction between portfolios of assets with different levels of physical climate risks. To this end, we think that the exposure to physical climate risks needs to be quantified under a globally consistent framework. And to do this, we've developed our physical climate exposure assessments, or climate EAPs, which use climate data provided by Jupiter Intelligence.
You mentioned Fitch's physical climate exposure assessments. So maybe you could explain what these are and how they are produced.
The physical climate exposure assessments are really at the heart of Fitch's contemplated framework. It's important to mention that although climate risks may in some cases already be captured within existing analytical assumptions, the use of climate data provided by Jupiter would allow us to apply a globally consistent approach based on recognized scientific data and considering specific climate scenarios. At its core, the analysis allows Fitch to assess the exposure of a location to key physical climate perils, such as fire, flooding, or wind, based on a specific time horizon. This analysis can be carried out for each different location within a portfolio and is primarily driven by data that spans more than 238,000 individual data points across the globe. For a specific location, the physical climate exposure assessment therefore considers the projected severity of different physical climate perils at a specified future projection period, as well as any change in the severity of the physical climate events experienced between our 2025 baseline period and the applicable projection period. So in short, Fitch's climate EAP provide a common measure of the severity and materiality of a location's exposure to physical climate risk over a specified time frame. This exposure is then aggregated at the portfolio level and could be communicated for a transaction or program based on easy-to-understand low to high exposure scales.
And are you able to tell us how the climate EAP could be used in the rating process? For example, would a high climate EAP have any rating impact?
It's important to note that there is a clear distinction between the exposure to physical climate risk and any potential rating impact. Under the framework that we're contemplating, we would adjust specific analytical assumptions to reflect any material physical climate exposures. But although a higher climate EAP would, all else being equal, typically result in more meaningful adjustments to asset assumptions, any rating impact would ultimately also need to consider potential mitigants. So in the end, while structured finance or covered bond ratings may be affected where the asset portfolio is exposed to material physical climate risks, structural mitigants such as credit enhancement or reserves, or even in some cases known property-specific characteristics, would also be considered when determining any rating impact on the notes or bonds. It's also worth noting that any adjustments to Fitch's analysis and analytical assumptions may also differ based on a type of underlying asset as well as any region or sector-specific considerations.
So you mentioned that Fitch decided to use Jupiter Intelligence's data. So why was this decision taken to use this data instead of publicly available or, let's say, more easily recognizable data sources?
One of the key benefits of Jupyter's data is really its level of granularity, which is important for a more meaningful and accurate physical climate analysis. It also matches up well to the geographical location information that's typically available for different structured finance and covered bond portfolios, and notably in relation to residential and commercial real estate. But just as importantly, Jupyter's data is not founded on historical observations, but rather provides a forward-looking assessment of physical climate conditions, considering specific climate scenarios. The data is based on recognized scientific models run under the CMIP6, as well as the World Resources Institute water stress indicators, which are then debiased with historical observations. Now, although we recognize that data available from other sources may be more widely used in certain regions, one of the guiding principles behind our contemplated analysis of physical climate risks is our ability to apply a globally consistent and comparable framework for all structured finance and covered bonds. And other data sources can remain fairly limited within a global context. The FEMA National Risk Index in the United States, for example, is largely an assessment of historical observations of climate events, which do not currently consider future scenario projections under different global climate models, nor the effects of more recent climate events.
And as a final question, could you quickly highlight how the framework you've explained today differs from the climate vulnerability signals framework, which is in place or is contemplated for use by other rating groups at Fitch?
So for other rating groups, such as corporates or sovereigns, project finance, or even financial institutions, climate vulnerability signals are used as a screening tool to signal a possible elevated risk that the ratings may be affected by climate risk in the future. For structured finance and covered bonds, however, the climate EAP would instead be used to determine analytical adjustments applied to the current rating analysis and that consider the likelihood that climate risk will affect asset performance over the life of the transaction. The differences in approach between structured finance and other sectors notably reflects that structured finance issuers are typically unable to take mitigating action to reduce physical climate exposures over time, unlike corporate bond issuers, for example.
Will, thank you very much for your insights, and thank you all for listening. For more information on what Will has explained to us today, please see the Structured Finance Physical Climate Risk discussion paper, which is available on our website, fitchratings.com. And we also encourage you to provide us with feedback and comments on this contemplated approach before the 13th of June. Thank you again.